Hi, my name is Carlton Herbert, and this is what I've put together for my presentation on my paper focused on community-led architecture. I decided to focus mostly on residential projects and analyze a couple of real-world examples that I found while researching, as well as residential projects that I've worked on in my own career. Um, when people think of architecture, I think of the grand buildings, large cathedrals, and such. But the field of architecture is a lot more diverse than that. One simplistic view of architecture could just be looking at kind of like the formal design process people go through when designing traditional buildings, or needing to know the various codes and regulations that tie into that. But architecture really is a lot more than that. And when you become an architect, you really need to know a lot more things than just that. Because most architecture is composed of large buildings that have more of a civic role. It's important to think about the effects that buildings will have on the entire community and how it affects groups of people as opposed to just individuals. And some architects realize and understand this and use it as a way to improve the community. But unfortunately, there are some architects who don't quite appreciate or understand how much of an impact their buildings do have and how much they should focus on that. The traditional model generally involves a couple of people, usually just the architect, client, and contractor or builder. And there's usually a standard traditional design method and process that the architects go through, creating several iterations and designs with final approval by the client. And most of this design work happens internally, and it's generally based on the architecture firm or team's understanding of the end users, rather than being real connected to the end user themselves. But there kind of seems to be this general understanding within that architects and designers have the understanding of the end user they're designing for, because it's a problem or a project that they are familiar with, or a category they're familiar with. But really, each project should be treated as a separate project, and this should be revisited each time, just to make sure that architects really do understand the end user that they're designing for. And ultimately, it's really about finding the balance between the traditional model and more of an end user focused model. When you bring in end users too much, it kind of changes the role of architects, and from more of a design role to more managerial. It's not necessarily a bad thing. It just becomes a little more complicated, takes a little bit more work, and is not what most architects are necessarily comfortable with in their design process. But this just means that it's a learning curve and adjustment that architects need to go through in order to involve end users more in their process. I was able to find several examples of where this was successful, as well as where architects maybe tried and failed. One example of successful that I found was this Granville New Homes redevelopment project. It was mostly successful because of the Glass House organization over in the UK. And they put together workshops to train stakeholders and residents. So they brought the residents in to become actual decision makers in the design of the process. They brought their own concepts, as well as worked through these workshops and training to progress the design concept in other ways, and also offered helpful guided contributions to the project. So instead of just bringing in the general public and taking opinions and their considerations, they actually trained and worked with some of the residents and future residents of the area to really develop the ideas that they did bring and build upon those. And this project won several awards, including the Building for Life Award and Sustainability Award, which just goes to show that you can focus on multiple things, not just community-led architecture, and still have a successful project. Unfortunately, there are also some failed projects. One project I found is the Make It Right housing development, and it's kind of famously and infamously was organized by Brad Pitt following Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans. As you can see on the left there, the entire area of this development was underwater following the hurricane. And so Brad Pitt kind of led the charge and put together a team with Graft Architects, as well as a few others, to create some designs for some really sustainable homes to rebuild this area. Problem was they brought in, I think it was 23 architecture firms to submit their designs for the homes, and they erred on the side of extremely modern and extremely sustainable, as opposed to what would fill the needs of the community members. And so most of the local residents were kind of taken aback with the designs, and because they weren't really familiar with the designs that they were faced with. But along with this, it also failed because because of a lack of construction administration. They had brought in a lot of national firms that really didn't have local people they could depend on for construction administration and oversight. And so there was a lot of kind of shoddy workmanship that went on due to cutting costs and budget constraints. So a lot of the homes that were built were not built that well, and they're currently caught up in a whole bunch of lawsuits and the like to try and deal with that. So unfortunately, the residents who lost their homes due to the hurricane were given homes that they didn't necessarily appreciate the designs of, and also were faced with some long-term defects in the homes as well. I have some experience in high-end kind of modern residential homes up in Jackson, Wyoming. So I just wanted to go over two projects, the design process for two of the projects that I've worked on. One of them would be this Fallen Pine project. The project was very smooth. It was brought about by an initial concept from some clients who wanted to fill the role of kind of a developer for the home to improve the community where it would be located. And they worked really hard with a bunch of local real estate firms to nail down what the needs would be for a future resident of the area. But they also took the approach of designing something that they themselves would want to live in, so that they could really make it personal and try and come up with the best options in design and in layout. The roles were very well established. The clients were familiar with the design process, and everyone felt very comfortable in their roles. And it really only took a few months to get through the design process. Another project I worked on was this Chisiyama project, and ultimately it was still able to go through the schematic design process, but the client was new to the entire process, which meant there was kind of a steep learning curve. They also didn't have a very well-defined concept, so it was a lot more figurative and thematic. And because they weren't familiar with the design method, they weren't really sure how to best contribute and how best to help with the design process and in providing feedback. So there was a lot of coaching and back and forth that needed to happen in order to kind of train the client on how best to approach the design process and work smoothly with the architecture firm. And obviously, this was a process that took a lot longer, but ultimately, it was still able to arrive at a good solution for all the parties involved. After looking at kind of a mix of some of those public and private examples, it's obvious that there's much that can be done to improve the social impact of architects, both on the side of the architects and the side of the public. Too many architects and designers attempt social improvement without a good base of knowledge and good expertise in the area. We need to try and involve end users, but we need to make sure that there's careful management and consideration from the design team, because ultimately architects are in charge of directing the project in a logical, meaningful manner. And you make sure that there are plenty of regular design reviews and some training of clients through that process. And ultimately, architects need to learn to work with people, not just buildings. It should evolve, the field of architecture should evolve in a way that public perception of architect's role is once both executive and personal. And we need to be able to relate to all of the parties that are involved in the process, not just become comfortable with more of the industry side on the developers and builders side, but also focusing on who the buildings actually will impact across their lifespan. We should try and design our practice around human involvement and connection so we can produce meaningful buildings that are personal to the end users. And with architect-led direction, the ideas and influence of community members can be translated and transformed into beneficial projects for all. So thanks for taking a look at this project.